السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أهلا بكم إلى هذه الحلقة من برنامج من الداخل عبر الميادين. معكم زينب صفار. لعل الحرب الاقتصادية السائدة ضد كوبا ونيكاراغوا وفنزويلا وسوريا وإيران وكوريا الشمالية واليمن والحصار المالي والعقوبات الاقتصادية الخانقة كذلك تتعارض مع ميثاق الأمم المتحدة والعديد من المعاهدات الدولية، ولا سيما معاهدات حقوق الإنسان مثل الاتفاقية الدولية الخاصة بالحقوق المدنية الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والثقافية واتفاقية حقوق الطفل، كما أنها تنتهك حظر القانون الدولي التدخل في شؤون الدول الأخرى الداخلية ومبدأ عدم التدخل الذي لا ينطبق على التدخل العسكري فقط ولكن أيضا على الحرب الهجينة غير التقليدية. لقد ثبت أن العقوبات تقتل، ليس فقط التدابير القسرية الأحادية الجانب، وإنما العقوبات الأممية الجائرة كذلك، كتلك التي طبقت على العراق بين عامي 1991 و2003 والتي أدت إلى وفاة أكثر من 1,000,000 عراقي بسبب سوء التغذية والحرمان من المياه النظيفة والأدوية والمعدات الطبية وما إلى ذلك. العقوبات تنتهك حقوق الإنسان وتقتل. نعيد ونكرر، العقوبات تقتل، لكن من؟ في عام 1995 قدرت اليونيسف أن العقوبات تسببت بوفاة نحو 500,000 طفل عراقي، لكن التحذير لم يسمع به أحد، والأسوأ أنه تم تجاهل تلك التحذيرات من قبل الولايات المتحدة. آنذاك عندما سئلت وزيرة الخارجية الأمريكية مادلين أولبرايت عما إذا كان الأمر يستحق الإبقاء على العقوبات ضد العراق على الرغم من وفاة العديد من الأطفال، أجابت بنعم. وقتها استقال منسق الأمم المتحدة للشؤون الإنسانية للعراق دينيس هاليداي احتجاجا، ووصف عقوبات الأمم المتحدة بأنها شكل من أشكال الإبادة الجماعية. كما استقال خليفته هانس فون سبونيك أيضا، وكتب كتابا حول الأمر بعنوان نوع آخر من الحرب. من الواضح تماما أنه عندما تفرض العقوبات على دولة ما فإن أكثر من يعاني هم النساء والأطفال، وهم الأكثر حرمانا وضعفا ويدفعون ثمن عواقب هذه العقوبات غير القانونية. السيدة ألينا دوهان المقررة الخاصة المعنية بالتأثير السلبي للتدابير القسرية أحادية الجانب على التمتع بحقوق الإنسان من قبل مجلس حقوق الإنسان التي عينت في آذار مارس المنصرم، ستكون معنا من مينسك في بيلاروسيا لتشرح هذه التدابير والعقوبات في زمن الكورونا والانهيار الاقتصادي والتغييرات البيئية وما يترتب عليها. Ms. Alina Douhan, new Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, Professor of International Law at the Belarusian State University and the Director of the Peace Research Center, talking to us from Minsk, Belarus. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the inside, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Pure pleasure to have you always. Well, Dr. Alina, you have taken up your functions on the 25th of March. When you refer to the unilateral coercive measures, what do these entail and how to challenge and address the negative impact of such measures and to further expose the nexus between sanctions and death?
Well, that's basically the question you are asking is a very complicated one. In accordance to the documents which have already been adopted by the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly, unilateral coercive measures go counter international law and they can't be adopted at the international intercourse. In practice, however, we see that quite a lot of unilateral sanctions are imposed, and moreover, these sanctions are imposed more and more broadly at the international area. And in this case, we come to the problem whether all unilateral sanctions constitute unilateral coercive measures, and how do unilateral coercive measures correlate with unilateral sanctions. In general, we shall realize that unilateral sanctions are a very broad category of notions. In some ways, for example, states today, due to the sovereign equality of states are free to decide whether they want to cooperate with another state or they do not want to do it. That's the free choice of a state. And in this case, if a state decides that it prefers to cooperate with one state or another, it doesn't mean that it applies sanctions or unilateral coercive measures to these states. At the same time, when application of unilateral measures within or beyond authorization of the UN Security Council, which moreover doesn't correspond the requirements neither of self-defense nor of countermeasures, including the collective countermeasures, and goes in breach of international legal norms, in this case we may speak about application of unilateral coercive measures, which are, as I have already said, recognized to be illegal in international law. That's why if you look, for example, at the documents adopted by the United Nations organizations and statements of high UN officials and at statements adopted by the special procedures as well, you will see that it uses the term unilateral sanctions. The situation in COVID pandemic is so complicated that today we need to settle, first of all, humanitarian concerns and then try to find how legal one or another activity taken unilaterally is. But when to realize what's going on today as concerned the unilateral sanctions, I believe I would give a couple of examples.
Right.
We all know that the UN Security Council is able to impose sanctions over states or even over individuals or entities. And these measures do not constitute unilateral sanctions because the UN Security Council is authorized to do it in accordance with the UN Charter. When we speak about unilateral sanctions, we speak about measures which are taken by states or regional organizations without authorization of the UN Security Council or beyond this authorization.
Like the sanctions practiced by the US of A against many countries, for example, in our part of the world.
That's basically true. If you look at the resolutions of the UN Security Council, you, for example, may find that the UN Security Council decided to put in the sanctioning list 5 individuals. But if you look at the sanctions imposed unilateral, you will see the long lists of individuals, entities, and even spheres of economy. So all these sanctions go beyond authorization of the UN Security Council, even in the case if there is a resolution of the UN Security Council regarding the situation in this country. So all these measures are unilateral sanctions.
Right.
And today we face a situation when unilateral sanctions are expanding enormously. It expands enormously as concerns the individuals, so the targets of the sanctions. These are entities, sectors of economy, types of individuals, regardless of what they are doing. I believe the very recent executive order of the United States, which announced imposing sanctions over officials of the International Criminal Court for trying to fulfill their duties, is a good example on the case.
And not to issue visas to the personnel and their family members also.
And also to people which tries to help the personnel to work. That means that human rights defenders are endangered as well.
Exactly. We will come to talk a bit about this particular issue, Dr. Alyna, but allow me here to ask you something. On the long term, these adverse unilateral coercive measures may result in social problems and raise humanitarian concerns in the states targeted. What are your guidelines, your recommendations on ways and means to prevent, to minimize, to redress the hostile impact of such measures on human rights, and how to promote accountability in this sense?
Well, when we speak about the preventive measures as concerned the humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions, we shall consider here 2 different aspects. The very first one, which I believe is the most urgent today, is how to prevent humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions in the course of COVID-19 pandemic. That's what we need to solve right now. And the second part is what to do to minimize or prevent humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions in general in the long-term review. When we speak about the preventing humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions in the course of pandemic, I would propose to refer to the document which I put on my webpage on the 1st of May, the guidance on elimination of humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions in the course of pandemic. And it had several lines, and the very first of these lines is that countries shall struggle pandemic in the spirit of solidarity, cooperation, and legality. So rule of law can never be violated. It basically refers back to the statements of the UN Secretary General, which says that life of every individual is matter. And when we come back to this situation, the second point is that trade or any other delivery of humanitarian or other substantial goods can never be prevented. It means we all have heard about the existing system of getting licenses or humanitarian exceptions or any other types. But in practice, these systems are rather complicated and quite often they are not transparent. On this point, we can see some slight steps forward, which are called to improve the situation. For example, the European Union has adopted a guidance how to get humanitarian exceptions and licenses, how to deliver humanitarian aid, for example, in Syria. Or we may see some slight steps when, for example, Zoom started to be softer as concerns providing the access and the possibility to be used for some countries for non-commercial activities. But as I see from the responses of targeted states, which came concerning the questionnaire on impact of unilateral sanctions in the COVID-19 on the Economy and, first of all, the human rights of the population, all of them say that humanitarian exceptions and guidances on licenses process do not change situation as such, because in practice there are cases when the license can be given to deliver humanitarian aid, for example, in Syria, but there are problems to buy petroleum, even for humanitarian organizations in Syria.
Law, the Caesar Act that is imposed by the US of A now.
So these situations are pretty problematic. And as concerned the guidance, it also speaks about the one of the very first requirements, which basically reflect the statements of the UN High Commission on Human Rights, some regional organizations and groups of states like NAM, for example, and the UN Secretary General was that at least in the course of pandemic, unilateral sanctions shall be lifted or at least suspended because humanitarian concerns shall prevail.
Right. We will come to further detail around this particular point, Dr. ألينا دوهان, but allow us to stop for a short break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود. لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد. ألينا دوهان, new special rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures. Welcome back to the show. Ma'am, well, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, while addressing the Human Rights Council, said that due to drastic global warming, due to pollution, it was registered a sharp rise of death and suffering from starvation, including women and children worldwide. I want to ask you here, what about Yemen? Is it global warming that causes so much of famine and death, of starvation, malnutrition, and suffering of children?
I may try to answer this question, but I would like to to ask you to take here into account that my mandate doesn't refer to the issue of the global warming as such. But when we speak about the aspects which may be related to the application of unilateral sanctions, it's generally recognized that basically human rights affected by the application of unilateral sanctions include inter alia the right to development. And if we refer, for example, to the concept of the sustainable development, we definitely see over there that it includes not only environmental aspects, which are definitely very important, but also the economic development. And here we can speak about the problem of the correlation and priorities between economy and environment. We all realize that when the country goes to, let's say, poverty, when the economic level of the country is falling down, decreasing a lot, in this situation, the government and the population will be interested most of all to guarantee the survival of the population, to guarantee the right to food, the right to health, and all other fundamental human rights, to guarantee the right to life as well. In this situation, every government in every country will be much more reluctant to spend money on, let's say, environmental protection at the expense of the protecting lives of people, at the expense of economy in this situation. And in this case, definitely the environmental situation will exacerbate. That's basically mean that to guarantee the sustainable development, a government is obliged to guarantee developments of all spheres of life, economic, environmental, as well as human rights standards. And as far as when we speak about unilateral sanctions, they affect a lot economy of the country as well as human rights. Definitely the very idea of sustainable development is suffering.
And this is what's happening in Yemen today, actually, and this is what's happening in many other parts of the world and states that are suffering from unilateral coercive measures. Allow me to ask you, ma'am, you have called on governments that use sanctions as foreign relation tools for the lifting of all such sanctions that obstruct the humanitarian responses of sanctioned states in order to enable their healthcare systems to fight the COVID-19, as you said, and to save lives, which ought to be a priority. To what extent were these governments responsive to your appeal to waive sanctions?
Well, as I have already said, today we can see only the tiny steps forward. So even despite the fact that the sanctioned states say that humanitarian exceptions do not change situation as such, I believe in the situation when we face today absolutely no consensus between sanctioning and sanctioned states, the only possibility for us to improve the situation is try to find this consensus. And that's, in this case, I may say, no sanctions have been withdrawn in practice. So this part of my call haven't been heard. But the very fact that the countries, sanctioning countries, started to hear at least a little bit the calls for consensus, like, for example, as concerned the guidances, they are probably not very effective, but still it's a step forward. The elimination of some hindrances to access Zoom as the means of communication for some countries, which also takes place today. The establishment of Intex as the means of conducting payments with Iran, which were prevented to be done because of the UN sanctions. And the attempts of some states to say, yes, we are trying to provide humanitarian aid to improve this conflict, I believe we need to see it as a positive sign. we can't change situation at one moment. But a very good point is to raise awareness of the problem. And again, for example, a good point over here can be this case of the ICC officials.
Right.
So the European Union was very much against imposing this type of sanctions, and both the European Union, Germany and Switzerland and France, if I'm not mistaken, said that these sanctions shouldn't be allowed.
Here, Elena, allow me to ask you, the post-pandemic world should be a world of international solidarity without unilateral coercive measures. This is the moment for the international community to reaffirm the principles of multilateralism contained in the UN Charter and demand that unilateral coercive measures that cause death and suffering be condemned by the ICC and the International Criminal Court as a crime against humanity. Yet, as you said, the US President Donald Trump recently authorized sanctions and additional visa restrictions against the International Criminal Court personnel in response to the court's decision to open an investigation into war crimes in Afghanistan. Your take, please, here.
I believe that if we want to find a consensus and to improve the life of people who are being affected by the sanctions, the only way to do it is to rely on international law. It's a very important step over here that we shall not take that much into account the political approaches or political observances. There is an international law, which there is a UN Charter and principles of the United Nations Charter, which have already exist long ago at the peremptory norms of public international law. These principles are very known to everyone: the prohibition of intervention, sovereign equality of states, the legal personality of every state. And it's time now to review all unilateral measures which have been applied from the point of international law. The application of unilateral coercive measures does not only undermine international law, but it also, upon my opinion, undermines the status of the UN organization as the organization which has introduced general principles of international law, on which the whole system of international relations is based. That's why I believe that our own way out is to build a consensus based on the rule of law. And in this case, I believe the United Nations organization shall play a very important role. And as far as we are looking for the consensus, we all shall be adhered to the rule of law as much as we can.
Right, you have made that point very clear. I have lots and lots of other questions I wanted to ask you, ma'am, but I'm afraid time has run short. From Minsk, Belarus, Dr. Alina Douhan, new special rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. Thank you for joining us and for your sharp insights, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا. من كل فريق عمل برنامج من كل الميادين، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.